The sun was beginning to sink behind the wide Texas sky as I drove up the long gravel driveway leading to my ranch. The air carried the sweet scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the faint aroma of wildflowers along the fence line. It was a perfect evening, peaceful, quiet, and exactly what I needed. The small lake at the edge of my property had always been a favorite spot for Clara and me. Its glassy surface mirrored the swaying oaks, and the gentle ripple of water provided a natural soundtrack to unwind after long days. But recently I had noticed that I wasn't spending nearly enough time there. Work, neighborhood drama, and the never-ending HOA headaches had kept me busy. So today I'd made a decision. It was time to reclaim my space, to find that simple calm I craved. And that meant setting up a hammock by the lake. I pulled into the shaded spot near two sturdy cedar trees that framed the water's edge. Pulling the hammock from the back of my truck, I started securing the straps around the trunks. It was a simple task, but after a week of stress, it felt like an act of rebellion and self-care wrapped in one. I smiled to myself, imagining lazy afternoons swaying gently, a book in hand, the sun warming my face. No drama, no disruptions, just peace. That's when I noticed the faint rumble of a car approaching. Looking up, I saw one of the HOA's ubiquitous golf carts trundling down the lane, bearing the logo of Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association on its side. I waved politely, but the cart slowed and then stopped a few yards away. The driver, a woman I recognized instantly as Marissa, the HOA's self-appointed enforcer, stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyebrows raised. "Evening, Chief," she said, her tone a curious mix of business and thinly veiled annoyance. "What's going on here?" I set down the hammock and gave her a calm smile. "Just setting up a hammock by the lake, trying to take some downtime." Marissa nodded slowly but didn't seem convinced. "You do know there are rules about property use by the lake, right? No permanent structures, no hanging equipment." I raised an eyebrow. "A hammock's not exactly a structure. It's temporary, easily removable, and it's on my property." She flipped through her clipboard, as if hoping to find some rule buried beneath a mountain of bylaws. "Well, we've had complaints. Some neighbors feel it changes the landscape, that it might even be a safety issue." I chuckled. "A hammock by the lake? A safety issue? Sounds like someone needs to get out more." Marissa didn't smile. Instead, she called her office, and soon enough, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens. Moments later, two patrol cars rolled up the driveway. It was ironic. Here I was, the police chief of our town, about to be confronted by officers called out over my hammock. Little did Marissa know, I wasn't just any resident. I was the chief. And this was about to get very interesting. The sound of sirens fading behind me never felt quite so surreal. Two patrol cars pulled up in front of the lake, their lights off but their presence loud and clear. I stood beside the hammock, calmly folding the straps as the officers stepped out. "Evening, Chief," said Officer Martinez with a grin that mixed surprise and awkwardness. I returned the nod, trying not to smile too widely. Being the town's police chief usually meant I was the one showing up, not being called out. The officers explained they'd received a call from the HOA about a possible unauthorized structure by the lake on my property. Marissa, the HOA's enforcer, was quick to point fingers, standing nearby with a clipboard like she'd just uncovered a crime scene. I took a breath. "Here's the thing," I said, gesturing to the hammock still tied neatly between the trees. "It's my property. No permanent fixtures. Just a hammock for relaxation." Marissa bristled. "Some neighbors are concerned. They think it might block access or be a hazard to kids." I shook my head. "Look around. The hammock is set back, easy to step around. And I've checked. There's no regulation against temporary hammocks on private land. Officer Martinez nodded in agreement. I've driven past this spot dozens of times. Never saw a problem. As the officers talked with Marissa, I noticed a few neighbors watching from their porches, whispering and pointing. The news of the HOA complaint and the police visit was already making rounds. It seemed my little hammock was stirring up more than just breeze. After some back and forth, the officers told Marissa there was no legal basis to ask me to remove the hammock. She shot me a glare that could freeze fire but said nothing further. The patrol cars eventually drove off, leaving me standing alone by the lake. That night, I sat on my porch thinking through the situation. Why was the HOA so intent on interfering with something as simple as a hammock? It wasn't just about rules, it was control. An attempt to micromanage residents and assert authority wherever they could. What made it worse was how the complaint had escalated to a police call. But here's the kicker. Marissa had no idea she was calling the police chief. If she had, would things have gone differently? Maybe. Or maybe it would have been the same power play, but with a little more caution. Either way, I knew one thing. This wasn't just about a hammock. It was a battle for who gets to decide what home means. And it was about to get a lot messier. After the unexpected police visit, the HOA seemed to double down on their objections. It wasn't just about the hammock anymore. It was about sending a message. No exceptions, no exceptions, not even to the police chief. I started getting notes slipped under my door, emails marked urgent, and messages from neighbors who felt caught in the middle. The HOA board, led by President Douglas, called an emergency meeting to discuss property use violations, a thinly veiled attack on my hammock setup. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs. When I arrived, I was greeted by a sea of familiar faces, many of whom seemed eager to weigh in. But behind the polite nods and forced smiles was a simmering tension. Douglas wasted no time. "Chief, while we appreciate your service to the town," he began, "we have to maintain consistent standards across the community. Hammocks, tents, temporary structures, they set a precedent." I raised a hand. "Is this really about the hammock? Or is it about control?" Douglas's jaw tightened. "The board is responsible for preserving property values and safety. We're acting on complaints." "Complaints that you won't identify, by the way," I countered. "If those neighbors are so concerned, let them speak for themselves." A murmur rippled through the room, but it was Marissa who took the floor next, stepping up with that clipboard like it was a weapon. "We've received multiple reports about the hammock blocking access to the lake, creating a potential hazard for children and pets. It also disrupts the natural look of the area." I glanced at the window toward the lake. The hammock sat nestled between two trees, nothing more than a splash of color in the green landscape. It wasn't an eyesore. It was a haven. "So let me get this straight," I said, voice steady. "You're regulating how I use my private property based on vague complaints about aesthetics and potential hazards, without any written rules against temporary hammocks." Douglas shifted uncomfortably. "Well, the bylaws don't specifically mention hammocks," he admitted, "but they do grant the board discretion to enforce rules to protect the community." "Discretion," I repeated, "which you're using to police my backyard." "But isn't that a slippery slope? Today it's a hammock, tomorrow it's a garden gnome, next week my barbecue grill." The room fell silent. Suddenly, Karen, a longtime HOA member known for her fierce adherence to community standards, spoke up. "This isn't about you, Chief. It's about us. The HOA is here to keep things orderly, fair, and safe." I looked her in the eye. "But it feels like you're trying to tell me how to live on my own land. Is that what fairness looks like?" She hesitated. Then, quietly, "It's complicated." It was complicated and frustrating. The HOA's overreach wasn't just bureaucratic nitpicking. It was a power play, a way to assert dominance over residents under the guise of community welfare, and that power wasn't going to be easy to shake off. That night, as I sat by the hammock under the starlit sky, I realized something else. This fight wasn't about a piece of fabric hung between two trees. It was about boundaries, personal and political, and I was ready to defend them. It was barely a week after the heated HOA meeting when I found myself standing by the lake again, this time with a sense of both frustration and resolve. The hammock was up, as usual, stretched comfortably between those two cedar trees, calling me to rest. But the peace I sought was about to be disrupted once more. Late in the afternoon, the familiar rumble of police cars echoed up the driveway. Two patrol vehicles rolled in, lights off but presence unmistakable. Out stepped Officers Martinez and Daniels, both friendly faces, but today their expressions were unreadable. Before I could say a word, Marissa appeared behind them, clipboard clutched tight. "Chief," she began, her tone as clipped as ever, "we've received additional concerns about your hammock, complaints that it's now obstructing common pathways near the lake." I raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "Common pathways? On my private property?" Marissa nodded firmly. "It's an area shared by the community, and the board has authority to enforce access." Officer Martinez cleared his throat and looked between us. "We're just here to check things out and mediate." That's when I decided to make my position clear. "I'm the police chief," I said calmly, though inwardly bracing for their reactions. "You're standing on my property. If there's an issue, let's resolve it. But understand that I'm also responsible for law enforcement here." The officers exchanged a quick glance. I saw a flicker of surprise in their eyes. They hadn't been informed. Marissa's mouth twitched, but she pressed on. "That doesn't change the fact that the HOA is acting within its rights to enforce rules for community safety." I looked around at the assembled neighbors who had gathered nearby, watching the unfolding scene with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. "Safety is important," I agreed, "but enforcing rules doesn't mean ignoring the law or personal rights. This hammock is not blocking access. If there's a genuine concern, let's address it openly and fairly." Officer Daniels stepped forward. "Chief, normally we'd mediate disputes like this with a warning or citation, but given who you are, I think we should handle this differently." The tension broke with a small chuckle from me. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, Daniels. But I'm not above the law, and neither is the HOA." We talked for a few more minutes, outlining what the real issues were: vague rules, overzealous enforcement, and a lack of clear communication between the board and residents. In the end, the officers agreed to hold off on any formal action pending a neighborhood meeting. That was the turning point. The HOA's attempts to control me had hit a wall, not just because I was police chief, but because the neighbors were starting to question what community really meant. Was it about rules or respect? About control or collaboration? I knew what side I was on. After the police visit near the hammock, things started to shift beneath the surface of Silver Creek Estates. The neighborhood was buzzing, but not just about my hammock. People were whispering about the HOA's growing reach, their aggressive tactics, and the murky motives behind their enforcement crusades. I decided it was time to dig deeper. I wasn't just the police chief. I was a resident, too. And if the HOA board was pushing boundaries with me, what were they doing to others? Using my position, I requested access to HOA meeting minutes, enforcement records, and correspondence. Officially, it was part of my role to ensure community safety and legal compliance, but unofficially, I wanted the truth. What I found was both revealing and troubling. First, the board's complaints were often anonymous or came from the same handful of residents who seemed invested in maintaining strict control over the neighborhood's appearance and activities. The HOA leadership appeared to use complaints selectively to intimidate homeowners who didn't toe the line. More disturbing, a developer with ties to some board members had been quietly pushing plans for a large-scale subdivision nearby. The HOA's tight control over community spaces and property use seemed designed, at least in part, to increase property values and smooth the way for this project. I realized the Hammock incident was less about a piece of fabric and more about maintaining power, keeping the neighborhood in a box that suited the board's interests. I also discovered that the HOA's enforcement procedures were often vague, with no clear policies on how and when complaints were investigated or acted upon. This gave board members a dangerous level of unchecked discretion. Armed with this knowledge, I started talking to neighbors one-on-one. Many admitted they'd been afraid to speak up, worried about retaliation or social isolation. But now, with evidence of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics and conflicts of interest, people were ready for change. I knew this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was the community's fight. A fight for transparency, for fairness, for the right to enjoy our own homes without constant fear of arbitrary policing. The next neighborhood meeting would be crucial. It was time to pull back the curtain, confront the board's overreach, and demand accountability. Because when power goes unchecked, it doesn't protect anyone. It just divides. After uncovering the HOA's behind-the-scenes maneuvers, I knew it was time to act, not just as a resident, but as the police chief entrusted with upholding justice and fairness in our community. The Hammock saga had become a symbol of a deeper struggle, the fight between individual rights and arbitrary power. I prepared myself for the upcoming neighborhood meeting, aware that tensions would run high. The HOA board had dug in their heels, and some residents were caught in the crossfire, but I was determined to stand my ground. On the day of the meeting, the community center was packed. Faces familiar and new turned toward me as I stepped up to the podium. I started by laying out the facts, the vague bylaws, the selective enforcement, the conflicts of interest, and the potential developer influence lurking beneath the surface. "I'm here not just as your police chief," I said, voice steady but firm, "but as your neighbor. Our community deserves transparency. We deserve rules that are fair, clear, and enforced equally. And most importantly, we deserve respect for our rights." A few murmurs of agreement rose from the crowd. The HOA board tried to counter with appeals to tradition and property values, but the momentum was shifting. I explained the legal boundaries governing HOAs in our state, highlighting that while associations do have authority to regulate common areas and certain aspects of property use, that authority is not absolute. They cannot arbitrarily restrict private property rights without clear, reasonable rules. Then I pulled out a copy of the letter from the HOA threatening to remove my hammock and insisted that such threats, made without proper legal basis, were unacceptable. I wasn't here to pick a fight. I wanted dialogue. I proposed forming a community committee to review the bylaws, improve transparency, and establish clear enforcement protocols. I emphasized that collaboration, not confrontation, would make Silver Creek Estates a better place. By the end of the meeting, the mood had softened. The board agreed to pause all enforcement actions related to the Hammock and other disputed cases while the committee did its work. But there was one thing I made clear. I would not tolerate further attempts to bully or intimidate residents, including myself. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors came up to thank me, expressing relief that someone was finally holding the HOA accountable. Walking out into the fading sunlight, I felt the weight of responsibility, but also hope. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But now I had allies, and I had the law on my side. After the community meeting, the atmosphere around Silver Creek Estates shifted noticeably. The once quiet neighborhood was now abuzz with conversations, some supportive, some skeptical, and a few downright hostile. It was clear that my stand against the HOA's overreach had stirred a hornet's nest. I started receiving messages from residents I barely knew, thanking me for speaking up. They shared stories of similar run-ins with the HOA, a neighbor who was fined for painting their front door a non-conforming color, another who faced threats for planting a vegetable garden. For many, the Hammock saga had become a rallying point. At the local cafe, conversations turned to HOA politics, and people began to question the board's decisions openly. Some homeowners, tired of feeling powerless, formed informal groups to discuss how to advocate for changes. The idea of a community committee to review HOA rules gained traction, but not everyone was on board. The HOA loyalists, often led by board members and their closest supporters, pushed back hard. They accused me of abusing my position as police chief, suggesting that I was using law enforcement to intimidate the board and manipulate community governance. One evening, I found a note taped to my front door. It was anonymous but unmistakably hostile. "Remember who you really work for. Don't forget your place." A chill ran down my spine. Being police chief didn't make me immune to threats or intimidation. Despite the unease, I refused to be deterred. I reached out to residents who felt marginalized or scared and assured them that standing together made us stronger. I worked with my officers to monitor the situation discreetly, ensuring that no harassment or retaliation escalated. Social media became a battleground. Posts both defending and condemning the HOA's actions flooded neighborhood forums. Some tried to twist the narrative, painting me as the antagonist. Others called for more transparency and democracy in the association's decision-making. Through it all, I reminded myself of why I fought this battle, not for power or ego, but for the right to live peacefully on my own land and for the community to be governed fairly. One afternoon, Clara and I sat by the lake, Hammock swaying gently between the trees. She squeezed my hand. "You're making a difference," she said softly. I nodded. "It's messy, it's hard, but it's worth it. Because in every conflict there's a chance for change, and in every voice raised there's hope for a better tomorrow." The tension in Silver Creek Estates had reached a boiling point, but amidst the growing divides there was a quiet push for dialogue. With the HOA board agreeing to pause enforcement actions, the community committee I proposed was ready to meet, and with it came a real opportunity to find common ground. The committee convened in the shade near the lake, right by the hammock that had sparked the controversy. It was a symbolic location, a reminder that this fight was about much more than rules. It was about community, respect, and shared spaces. I sat across from Marissa, Douglas, Karen, and several neighbors representing a range of views. The atmosphere was tentative but hopeful. I opened the meeting by acknowledging the deep emotions on all sides. We all want Silver Creek Estates to be a great place to live. We just see different paths to get there. Marissa was the first to speak after me, her tone softer than usual. "I admit, maybe we got carried away. Some of us have been holding on to strict rules because we fear change or losing control." Douglas nodded slowly. "We want to protect our property values and safety, but perhaps we haven't been listening enough." Others chimed in with suggestions: clearer, simpler rules about temporary structures, a transparent process for handling complaints, regular community forums to discuss concerns before they escalate. I shared my perspective as both police chief and neighbor. The law supports the HOA's role, but only if it's balanced with respect for individual rights. Enforcement should be fair, consistent, and backed by clear guidelines. We drafted a preliminary framework for updated bylaws, one that emphasized communication and mediation before penalties. The goal was to empower residents to voice concerns without fear and to give the HOA tools to address legitimate issues without overstepping. Over the next few weeks, the committee worked diligently. Progress wasn't smooth. Old wounds and mistrust lingered, and some board members resisted change. But the shared commitment to finding solutions kept us moving forward. One afternoon, as I sat in the hammock watching the sunset, I felt a shift, not just in the landscape, but in the community spirit. The lake no longer symbolized conflict, but possibility. It wasn't perfect yet. The fight for balance between order and freedom, community and individuality, was ongoing. But for the first time in a long time, I felt we were on the right path. Together, the committee's work began to bear fruit as we drafted clearer, fairer guidelines for property use within Silver Creek Estates. The atmosphere was cautiously optimistic, but rewriting the HOA rules was no small task. It required navigating long-held traditions, emotional attachments, and legal frameworks that had been neglected or ignored for years. The new proposals emphasized transparency and fairness. They defined what constituted temporary structures like my hammock and established a clear process for residents to raise concerns or complaints, one that demanded accountability from the HOA board and prevented arbitrary enforcement. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of a mediation-first policy. Before any penalties or citations, residents and the HOA would have to meet, discuss issues openly, and work toward resolution. This shift aimed to reduce conflicts escalating to police involvement or legal action. When we presented the draft rules to the neighborhood at a special meeting, I could feel the tension in the room, old suspicions mixed with hope. The floor opened for questions and comments, and a surprising number of residents stepped forward to voice their support. One elderly woman who had long felt bullied by the HOA's strict color codes spoke up. "Finally, someone is listening. I want to paint my front door without fear." Another, a young family concerned about safety, appreciated the clearer guidelines on common areas. Even some of the HOA loyalists admitted that change was necessary to rebuild trust. The board agreed to hold a formal vote on the new bylaws within the month. It was the first time in years that real progress toward reform seemed possible. Meanwhile, I kept the hammock set up by the lake. It was no longer just a piece of fabric. It was a symbol of perseverance, a quiet victory for personal freedom and community respect. But I stayed vigilant. The old guard wasn't entirely gone. Some still resisted transparency and collaboration, and I knew they might try to stall or undermine the process. Still, the momentum was with us. And with the law on our side, the community behind me, and my badge as a reminder of my duty, I was ready for whatever came next. Silver Creek Estates was changing, and this time it was for the better. The day of the HOA vote on the new bylaws arrived like a storm, charged with anticipation, anxiety, and the heavy weight of months of conflict. Silver Creek Estates Community Center was packed to the brim, neighbors from every corner showing up to witness what could be a turning point for our neighborhood. I took my seat quietly, feeling the familiar mix of responsibility and hope. Around me were faces that had been part of this saga, some supportive, some skeptical, others openly hostile. The board president, Douglas, opened the meeting with a speech reminding everyone of the importance of community values and property preservation. Then came the presentation of the proposed bylaws, crafted by the committee, emphasizing fairness, transparency, and communication. When the floor opened for debate, voices rose, passionate, heartfelt, and sometimes sharp. Karen argued that the HOA needed to maintain strict control to protect property values. A few others echoed concerns about opening the floodgates to disorder. But many residents, emboldened by the fight and the changes they'd seen over recent months, spoke in favor of the reforms. They shared personal stories of how the old enforcement methods had caused pain, fear, and division. I spoke last, calmly reminding everyone that a community is only as strong as the respect and fairness it upholds. We can either continue down a path of conflict and mistrust, I said, or we can choose to build a neighborhood where voices are heard, rules are clear, and rights are protected. The vote was called. The room held its breath as the ballots were counted. When the results were announced, a clear majority had voted in favor of the new bylaws. There was applause, tentative at first, then growing. Some board members accepted the result with grace. Others left quietly, their opposition unmistakable. In the weeks that followed, the HOA began implementing the new policies. Complaints were handled with mediation, transparency reports were published, and the community felt a newfound sense of trust. The hammock by the lake remained, a quiet symbol of the battle fought and won. But peace, as I knew, was never guaranteed. Challenges would come again, and vigilance was necessary. Still, as police chief and neighbor, I was proud of what we'd achieved. Silver Creek Estates was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a community renewed, a place where everyone, no matter their role or title, could feel at home.